Hey, Pastor Jason here, and today I want to talk to you about Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We know that these guys ran around with Jesus and the other disciples, not only through their individual writings, but others as well. The thing that makes these three writings different is the fact that they're so similar. They're all writing about Jesus and his ministry while he walked the earth, and each one of them from their own point of view, giving us their understanding of the events that took place, what Jesus was saying, and what I believe as what they personally thought was important. I say that because we see the same stories, but one might elaborate more on what happened, whereas another might give us a Reader's Digest overview of what took place. For example, the parable of the seed, or sometimes called the parable of the sower, is found in each of the Gospels, and for the most part, it's pretty much the same. There are a few differences, and so when we study them together, I feel like we get the whole story. I'm going to read it really, really quick, and then we are going to kind of break down each one a little bit to see the differences. Okay, so we're going to read in Matthew. It says, "That same day Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea, and great crowds gathered about him, so that he got into a boat and sat down, and the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, A sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seeds fell on the rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and produced grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears, let him hear." A couple of the differences we see in verse 1 of Matthew. He points out that Jesus went out of the house. That's only found in his gospel. And by the way, this is the ESV version. In Mark's gospel, we see in verse 3, he says, "Listen and behold, a sower went out to sow." So he really emphasizes Jesus's, intro there, I guess. And then in verse 7, it says, "Other seed fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain." So he points out that it yielded no grain in verse 7. And then in Luke, Luke is the shortest one out of all three of them. He just kind of does the Reader's Digest high overview and gets to the point. But we do see some differences. In verse 5, it says, "A sower went out to sow his seed, and as he sowed, some fell along the path." Same so far. But then he adds, "and was trampled underfoot." So that's pretty cool. And then it goes on and says, "And the birds of the air devoured it." So he adds the birds of the air. I'm not sure why he adds, that the birds are of the air. Maybe, there's penguins or chickens around that weren't of the air. But then in verse 6, it says, "And some fell on the rock." So he doesn't say rocky soil. He just says the rock. "And as it grew up, it withered away because it had no moisture." I think that's pretty important to point out, especially if Jesus really mentioned that it had no moisture. I think that's a pretty cool thing that you can study and get deep into, not having moisture. It's pretty important to have moisture. And then later in verse 8, and also in Mark's gospel at the very end, both of the writers, Mark and Luke, they say that Jesus said, and he said, "He who has ears, let him hear." And Luke says that he called out, "He who has ears, let him hear." Whereas in Matthew's gospel, he just writes, "He who has ears, let him hear." He doesn't necessarily say, "He said." And then the only other thing that I can really see in these three right now is that in Matthew, he says some produced 100-fold, 60, some 60, and some 30. Whereas in Mark's gospel, it's backwards. He said increasing and yielding 30-fold, 60-fold, and 100-fold. So we see those things and we see the differences. They don't disapprove them, but I think they make them more believable because they each wrote from their viewpoint. That was the Synoptic Gospels. I hope you enjoyed that tip, reading them all together and kind of seeing the differences. And I hope this helps you. My name's Jason, and we'll see you later.